Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Izzy Fuqua. I'm the Adult Programs Coordinator for the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and I work with my wonderful colleagues to put on a monthly gallery talk called 3 in 30. The concept being that we talk about 3 works in roughly 30 minutes. Now, with today, you'll get way more than 3, and it's going to be a wonderful talk. Twyla Kitts, who is our teacher programs educator, will present today on Passing It On, Artists as Teachers. She will talk for roughly 20 minutes and then we'll spend the remaining 10 with Q&A. So with that, Twyla, I'm going to turn it over to you.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Izzy. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this exploration of artists as teachers. In my role as the teacher programs educator here at the museum, I've done my very, very best to support teachers since last March when things went kind of haywire. Many of them went virtual, and I have heard from them things like, I feel like I am on the struggle bus daily and I am drowning. And my favorite, my hair is on fire. But that has not stopped them from doing absolutely everything they can do to support their students during these difficult times. And for art teachers, not only were they struggling with making the connections through a virtual platform, but they also had to get them art supplies with often no budget. So I just wanted to give you one example of what that was like. One teacher in Spotsylvania convinced Lowe's, the paint store, to donate those big paint stirrers for her students. She hot glued the bottle caps to them, filled them with tempera paint, and once the paint had dried, each student received this palette in their supply packet that they picked up at the school. But she made 600 of them, which I just thought was really kind of incredible. So a lot of the artist teachers that we're going to consider today also made a difference in their students' lives far beyond just teaching them art skills, art making skills. There was a personal support there too. So I thought we should start in the atrium because that's usually where we meet for a 3 in 30. So here's our beautiful new atrium with procession by Odile Donald Odita. So you should come and visit. We're great for all seasons and our safety protocols are great. So as we walk up into the galleries, we're going to think about a little bit of background, but because I really wanted to think about how artists got from a very linear painting like Edward Jackland Jr. by Nehemiah Partridge to John Singer Sargent in just a few generations. I thought that would really be kind of interesting. And did you know that you really can take a virtual walk through the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts? If you go to the main site and go to Learn, and then click on the little magnifying glass, that will bring you to this page. And then you can actually choose Gallery Preview here in the drop-down menu. And then you can actually, these controls will take you from one level to another. So it's really, really fun to have a virtual walk through the museum. Now, of course, this was a moment in time when Google Arts and Culture came and filmed the museum or videoed the museum. So it won't be exactly like what's on view now, but luckily, almost all of the pieces that we're going to look at today were on view when they did this. So here we are walking through the early American galleries. We've gone up the stairs. As we walk through, we're going to kind of notice a couple of works by Benjamin West, who is really the first great artist to become a mentor in the early United States or early colonies. He was actually born in Springfield, Pennsylvania, but he showed really early promise as a great artist. And he spent some time in Philadelphia where he actually did learn from some artists who had had the opportunity to study in Europe. One of the reasons that those early limner paintings look so odd to us is that they mostly just had prints to look at. So they were linear. So it wasn't until American artists started having the ability to see things that were made in England that they began to kind of go beyond that linear early portrait style. So by 1760, Benjamin West had come up with a couple of sponsors who allowed him to travel to Italy, where he actually learned mostly by copying from the great masters. And I think that's something that we sometimes discount today because there's such an emphasis on being original, but that really was the way many, many early artists learned their trade. They would figure out how earlier artists had done that. He also took part in the Grand Tour. He became steeped in the neoclassicism that was prevalent or beginning to be prevalent at about that time. But his greatest legacy was probably in his role as a teacher, because all of the upcoming artists would come and stay with him. Well, maybe not in the same place, but they would meet with him when they traveled to England. He supported them by giving them jobs, by making contacts. Some of them he taught directly. He had a terrific impact on artists, including Gilbert Stuart, John Turnbull, Samuel Morse. And we just have to have a small segue here, because I just need to point out that if they ever did a movie of his life, Charles Dance really needs to play him. I thought that was really kind of cool. But getting back to our main theme, here we have Charles Willson Peele, who studied with Benjamin West in England from 1767 to 1770 before he returned to his native Maryland. But later on, he was one of the founders of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, which was the first art museum and school of the arts in the United States, founded in 1805. And that was really important because that gave people the opportunity to really study and learn their trade right here in the United States. And of course, we all know that Charles Willson Peele made this wonderful painting of William Smith and his grandson, but perhaps you did not know, but the VMFA collection includes several paintings by other paintings by Charles Willson Peele, as well as works by his brother, his son, and his niece, Sarah Miriam Peele. And he actually had 16 children by 2 wives and then married again a 3rd time. So he really kind of set up they had terrific influence in many fields in the United States. So we're going to walk on to the McLaughlin galleries and consider Robert Henri, because that, as we went from Benjamin West through Peele and on down through the generations of artists, that really is going to end up taking us to painters like Sargent. So, but after Sargent, we have Robert Henri, who was actually born Robert Henri Cozad, but changed his name after his father was involved in a shootout over cattle grazing rights. He later studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia, that very same institution that was partly founded by Charles Willson Peele. But then later on, he too was able to travel to Paris to study under Bouguereau. He was admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts. He visited Brittany and Italy. So he really did absorb all of the things that were going on in Europe, but he chose to return to the United States and to make his influence felt there and to look for sort of a new way of painting, a new way of pursuing the art moment, I suppose you would call that. So he is associated with the Ashcan School, which was really a reaction against American Impressionism and academic realisms, such as the Society of Portraits of John Singer Sargent. Now, I actually think that Henri would have very much appreciated many of the works in our collection where Sargent was actually exploring his own interests in art, but it's really more the society portraits that he is reacting to. So the name Ashcan School really was very much like the term Impressionism. It was not really meant to be complimentary. And a cartoonist named Art Young was actually made sort of disparaging comments about this drawing by Bellows, which was entitled Disappointments of the Ash Can. But it caught on, and curators were soon using this term to refer to this group of artists, which really wasn't a school, and its adherents embraced various styles, but it stuck. And so now we still talk about the Ashcan School. Also, Robert Henri was a phenomenal teacher, so much so that his students would take copious notes. And the Art Spirit is sort of a compilation of his class notes by one of his main students and articles that he read, notes that he made for various reasons. So it's a really interesting book. You can't read it straight through. And it's a little bit repetitive, but it's fascinating. As you can see, I'll hold up these are all of the places in the book that I need to go back to because I want to try out something that he suggested. So he also talked about that there's always the new movement. There's always been the new movement. It is a strange thing which comes as regularly as clockwork. It's strange that the thing that comes as regularly as clockwork should always be a surprise. So he is recognizing that even though he's bringing a new sensibility to making art, looking at regular people, looking at life itself, much more than just society pictures, that he realizes that someone else will be there to take over for the next generation. But I just pulled out a few of the quotes from this. We are not here to do what has already been done, know what the old masters did, know how they composed their pictures, but do not fall into the conventions they established. They made their language, you make yours. When the artist is alive in any person, he becomes an inventive, searching, daring, self-expressing creature. He disturbs, enlightens, and he opens the way for a better understanding. And I think that's he really wanted to catch the moment, almost the soul of the person that he was trying to paint, to look beyond just the surface. So for example, in The Spanish Girl of Madrid, you can see how he is really chosen to pull out elements of her attire that just sort of enhance that stance, that moment in time that he's caught here. And I thought it was really interesting. He wrote several times about clothing and how not to see the clothing as clothing, but as part of the person. So for example, the lace on the lady's sleeve is no longer lace, it is part of her. The color in her cheek is no longer a spot of red, but the culminating note of an order which runs through every part of the canvas, signifying her sensitivity and her health. So we talked a lot about backgrounds too, and how that needed to be part of the whole composition, that everything needed to work together to produce that wonderful effect. And I think you can see the difference here in this very posed image by John Singer Sargent, and this almost snapshot capturing of the Spanish Girl of Madrid, just how very different they are in effect and also in impetus. Probably the society portrait was meant to show this, I think it's Mrs. Darby off in a very specific milieu of society, whereas the other one is really just trying to catch the essence of this young lady. So Henri began teaching at the Philadelphia School of Design for Women in 1892, but he soon attracted a number of followers, including John Sloan, George Lukes, William Glackens, and Everett Shinn, and they all worked as illustrators for the Philadelphia Press. So they would meet at Henri's apartment to draw, to talk, to discuss, and he writes a lot about authors in his book too. Emerson, Thoreau, Zola, but particularly Whitman. He was very, very interested in how Whitman had captured what it was to be alive. He talks a lot about being alive, and there all the gentlemen there chatting. So by 1895, he had really decided to reject the Impressionism and the academic painting styles that he had encountered in Europe, and he wanted to find a new realism to paint scenes of ordinary people in America, to paint in the style of Walt Whitman's writing. So he made a big deal about talking not art for art's sake, but art for life's sake. So all four of these charcoal club artists followed Henri to New York when he relocated there in 1904. And I thought this was kind of cool to look at what the skyline of New York looked like in 1900. So you can see that all four of these are very, very different in sort of look and conception, but they all do have sort of gestural rough brush strokes because they're trying to catch that motion, that moment, and rapid execution. He was big on that. He really felt very strongly that making quick sketches was a wonderful way to kind of catch that moment, and also training your memory to catch that moment. And I just think all of these are just wonderful paintings. A work of art is the trace of a magnificent struggle. So even though these are all very different, they're all artists who are trying to capture that moment, to capture that look. So there were at one point 8 of them who organized a show designed to protest the restrictions imposed on exhibitions by the National Academy of Design. And again, that's another example of that, a new movement rising up to take a place of the old. The group became known as the 8, although after George Bellows later joined the group, I think there were more of them than 8, but all of them had work in the exhibition. Later on, Henri Sloane and some others also organized the Exhibition of Independent Artists, which was inspired by the French Salon des Indépendants. This show was non-juried and without prizes, and that was really unusual for the time. But Henri felt very strongly that artists should not be set up to compete against one another, because each artist needed to find his own voice, his own understanding of the world around him. So Henri taught at the New York School of Art from 1902 to 1908, and then later at the Art Students League of New York from 1915 to 1927. But as he noted, new movements are always on the rise, and with the Armory Show in 1913, American art really started going into new, more modern directions, and Henri's influence diminished, but he still left behind an incredible legacy in his work and his teaching. So we're going to move next to the mid to late 20th century art gallery and the modern and contemporary art galleries and see what we find there. And we're going to look at work by Thomas Hart Benton, who was born in Neosho, Missouri, into an influential family of politicians and lawyers. His father expected him to go into politics. In fact, he sent him to military school, but his mother did support his interest in art. So he was able in 1907 to enroll at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, but then he too later moved to Paris to study at the Académie Julienne. And while he was there, he really did some experimentation with the ideas of synchromism, which were developed by American artists Stanton McDonald Wright and Morgan Russell. And McDonald Wright was a really good friend of Benton's. And the synchronism, one of the things they were trying to do was they were trying to use color in the same way that musicians use chords. So they, and it came from kind of the word symphony, which means with sound. So they also, many of the works had a sort of central vortex or almost a pole around which things spun or spiraled. So that movement was a very important part of it as well. And some of these artists were abstract, and but some of them actually did some representational stuff as well. And many of these works by Thomas Hart Benton were really lost for years. But in about 1981, it turned out that he had left behind a suitcase in one of his New York apartments that was found by Jackson Pollock's older brother, Charles Pollock. Eventually it came to light in about 1981, and we've been able to go back and look at some of these works, these early works by Thomas Hart Benton. Oh, and I just love that this one was owned by H.L. Mencken, who is the person who gave it the title Bubbles. That's not a title that Thomas Hart Benton gave it. So Benton was actually very interested in music throughout his life, and he played the harmonica. And I just think it's wonderful that we have in our collection this wonderful little sketch of Benton's musical practice with the inscription that Benton's musical practice was held at Jackson Pollock's once a week. So that really underscores, again, this artist whose influence on the life of his students goes far beyond just teaching technique. So here we have Brideship. And Benton moved to New York, to New York in 1912 from Paris, but then served in the US Navy during World War I. And while he was stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, he became interested in US history. And Brideship is sort of came as a part of the American historical epic, his first mural cycle, and he conceived it to present a people's history. So I think you can kind of look at him as an interesting, not follower directly of Robert Henri, but someone who came after, who was also trying to give us glimpses of what America was really like. So he declared himself the enemy of modernism and became one of the leaders of the American scene painters, also known as regionalists. He actually took a trip back to Missouri in 1924. His father was ill, but he found himself really drawn to drawing scenes of rural steel mills, logging camps, coal mines, cotton fields, all kinds of things like that. He actually made he traveled around America making quick sketches that became the basis for many of the murals that he worked on after that. He taught at the Art Students League of New York from 1926 to 1935, and it was there that Jackson Pollock was one of his students and a close friend of the family. He used to babysit for Benton's little boy. He actually vacationed with him in Martha's Vineyard. I think at one point he lived in his garage or his garage apartment. Now, Pollock later on discounted Benton's influence on his work, but many scholars really have pointed out that the spiraling designs, the rhythmic patterns, the vibrant colors that appear in many of Pollock's large-scale paintings really do sort of look back to things that he might have gotten from Benton. And I think if we have a look there at this number 15, 1948 by Jackson Pollock, and look back at the study for bootleggers, I think you can see where some of that might have grown out of. Even though it was abstract, you still see that whirling, vigorous motion going on in the painting there, which I think is kind of cool. So Benton was also the first artist to have a work on the cover of Time magazine. It was one of his self-portraits, and that really helped make his career. He moved to Missouri in 1935 to teach at the Kansas City Art Institute, and he continued to teach there until 1941. And Jackson Pollock was sort of left behind to pursue his own career. But I think it's really interesting that when the Blue Poles was being purchased by the National Gallery of Australia, Benton was known to comment that I taught Jack that. And I think, again, you can see these vortexes here with all of the swirling movement around it. So there really was a connection between these two men. This is the 1949 article in Life magazine that pushed Pollock to the forefront of American pop culture. So I think it's also really interesting that it was their appearance in large magazines that really helped their careers enormously. And I just wanted to point out, I couldn't find a really great image of this, but in the collection of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, Bernard Martin, who taught at VCU for many, many years, made this really detailed painting of the entire spread in the Jackson Pollock magazine, which is really kind of funny because it's very realistic, but it's of someone who was totally devoted to abstract painting. So it's really funny. And I love that he even reproduced the advertisements in the magazine as well. For our next stop, we're going to return to the modern and contemporary late 20th century gallery and have a look at some works there, particularly one by Sara D. November, who was a very successful 20th century painter. Her work was exhibited at the 1939 World's Fair. She had some works that actually were shown internationally as well. This painting is a self-portrait that she did in 1932. And in that very same year, when she was teaching an art class at the Valentine Museum, she received a telegram that this self-portrait had been accepted by the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C., but it now hangs in the Valentine's Education Center, which is named in her honor. And the Virginia Museum has this work by Sara D. November called Daily Devotions. And when I first saw this, I kind of had an attitude it was very nice, but it was rich ladies playing cards who didn't have anything better to do. And I think I was a little bit judgmental about her then, only to find out how wrong I was in my assumptions. So I think it's really kind of neat that in addition to this finished painting, we also have this study for the daily devotions. So you can kind of see how that was developing. And then this early sketch. So it's really kind of neat to follow that through. But as I read the label copy on that, it turned out that she was the chair of the Richmond Academy of Arts Committee of Fine Arts. She had a lot to do with raising money to open the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and the idea for the Artmobile, which helped to shape the evolution of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. It was her idea. She was actually born and trained in New York, and she did a lot of work for producing commercial illustrations for various retail stores. We have a number of things in our collection site, so you might want to sort of explore some of the other drawings that we have by her. She moved to Richmond in the mid-1920s with her husband and began to spend more time on her painting and studied privately with Teresa Pollock, for whom the Pollock building at VCU is named. And Pollock, of course, was one of the founders of the of VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University. But in 1934, Sara D. November established and began teaching free art classes for African Americans at Richmond's Phyllis Wheatley YWCA. So I thought, well, that's really kind of cool. And then I also learned that she served on the board of the Craig House Arts Center, which was created to foster an interest and participation in art among Negroes. The center operated from 1838 to 1941 in a building at 1812 East Gray Street in the Shockoe Bottom neighborhood. So I thought that was really kind of cool. So I really had to reinvent my ideas of who this woman was. And as I was doing various research, I ran across this article in the archives of the Library of Virginia that talked about a new exhibition that was opening at Craig House, presenting its third exhibition opening next Sunday with a show of paintings by Edmund Archer and wood carvings by Leslie Bowling. And then I noticed that this exhibition of 12 Archer paintings and several Bowling pieces will be open to the public through May 13th, said Mrs. Sara D. November, Craig House board member in charge of the lecture and exhibition. So she really did her best to support rising artists. And I actually transcribed some of the central portion of this because I figured it would be hard to read. Mr. Bowling will lecture at the opening of the exhibition at 7:30 p.m. Sunday to artists, workers, and members of Craig House and their guests. The Negro artist has been called the most important Native artist in Virginia by Thomas Benton, the very Thomas Hart Benton that we just talked about, and has received considerable acclaim for his little wood carvings that have been in New York and other art centers. Porter at a Main Street stationery company, the artist has carved many characters, studies of athletes, laborers, and other types. And also, I realized as I was doing this research that this article was in the Richmond Times-Dispatch on April 9th, 1939, which was the exact same Sunday that Marian Anderson was giving her concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. I just love when you just stumble across all these really cool connections. So here's Leslie Garland Bowling, and you can see that this is Cousin on Friday, which is the very first work by an African-American to enter the collection of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. That happened in 1944, and it was a gift of the Honorable and Mrs. Alexander Weddell, who were the owners of Virginia House. He had been an ambassador. And I also, in doing some research on them, discovered that they very much were working on encouraging the integration of neighborhoods very early on in Richmond, Virginia. So I thought that was kind of cool too. So Cousin on Friday is part of a series that he did where he showed the people that he knew around him working on the various days of the week. So here's quilt making. Another in the Virginia Museum's collection. And I should mention that the Library of Virginia has a fabulous site all about Leslie Garland Bowling. So if you want to learn more about him, you might go there and check out that site. And Edward Minor Archer was the other artist who was going to be in that exhibition. And of course, Maggie is in the collection of the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And I also discovered that there was a small display of Edmund Minor Archer's work in 1938, and you can go online and see what that was all about. Here are actually some sketches of Sara D. November's son, Neil, reading, and I thought those were really kind of cool. And I don't know if you are familiar with the Novembers, but Neil November was a hugely important person supporting the arts in various cultural centers in Richmond, along with his wife, Sarah Bell November. So he married someone with this, the same name as his wife, but you will probably recognize her name from being on almost every theater in Richmond. She was very much a supporter of the arts and many other things as well. They were just incredible. So Sara D. November raised a son who went on to follow her tradition of supporting arts and students all over the place. And here you can see that same painting that was in their home. It's also Sara Bell November, the lady who married Sara D. November's son, might well have taken your coat at the coat check at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. I think it's really incredible that this woman who had been on the council for many years, who had endowed theaters, who had done so many things, was supportive of the museum to the point where she would check people's coats. That always just kind of floored me when I would see her doing that. So that's really what I had for you this morning, and I just want to underscore my thanks to all the teachers everywhere, because you're just so awesome.
Well, and I think that trajectory that you supplied us with underscores that, Twyla. Thank you so much. So we do have a couple of questions. I'm so glad you made that connection about Sara D. November, her son, marrying another Sarah, but someone who was also very integral into the arts community, theater specifically. That was a question. So thank you for doing that. And then just going back to the beginning, I was wondering if you could maybe summarize for us what exactly was Robert Henri rebelling against in John Singer's portraits? I think you talked about it a bit, but what is the big departure from what Sargent was doing to what Henri and the rest of the 8 were really interested in?
Well, and I think, Izzy, you can jump in here anytime you want to, because I know you're totally an expert on this, but I think it's really first of all, who is it that they're painting? Henri was not painting rich society women. He was painting children in Ireland. He was painting that the gentleman who he called a Spanish, is of Spanish descent. Let me see if I can go back to that. He actually spent a while in Taos, painting just people that he saw. He didn't really want to paint. Yeah, here, that one. He didn't, that's again, very, very different from that. But even the props that the John Singer Sargent, the people in the portraits have, are pointing to their wealth, to their position in society, and not really to their inner essence, I guess you would say. Yeah. And I think Sargent did get that to a certain degree, but you can also see the paint work here. Actually, when you look at some of the things that Sargent was doing for himself in our collection that weren't society portraits, I don't think there is as much difference, because I think they were really after something of the same thing to catch that moment. But these are just, it's not the same thing. He's really looking at people from different ethnicities. He was very interested in that, just really kind of capturing that moment.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the phrase, the edges of society, if you will, not necessarily the people that, everyone recognizes or knows their names.
Right.
Sometimes these people are the unknown. So catching that unknown person, but what makes them who they are.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And urban scenes, kind of gritty, I think.
Yes.
When we think of Ashcan School,
right.
It's kind of more in that direction.
Versus Sargent and that golden age, right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah, yes. Absolutely.
Right.
Another question, going back to Peele, since we're working backwards, how did this play out with the American Revolution and feelings of rebellion against England? And at the time, was Peele seen as a traitor, or was the art world separate from that?
No, I don't think he was seen as a traitor. In fact, the William Smith portrait was essentially a campaign poster for the first Congress of the United States. William Smith was running for office in Maryland, and this really was meant to show him as the agrarian, well-read, scholarly person that you would want representing you in the first Congress. Now, I think Copley did end up going back to England because he really was not in favor of the colony splitting from England. But I really don't think that Charles Willson Peele was ever considered not supportive of the new nation.
Okay.
And his children, his 16 children, went into various professions. A lot of them were ornithologists, which I thought was really interesting as well. So, yeah.
Well, just 2 final questions. You'd mentioned that a lot of the works that we saw today were on view. Do you know if any of the November works are on view right now?
No, it's not anymore. So, but I think they are trying in that same little area to rotate in and out things by Virginia artists. I've kind of
Okay.
noticed that.
So we'll have to
So
keep an eye
Adele Clark was another person who was very involved in the founding of the museum, and we have a number of works by her. I think maybe there's a Nottingham going up.
Oh,
Who again was another Virginia artist. So I would have to go look, but
yeah, we'll have to keep an eye out too.
right,
And then
yeah.
the last thing I wanted to end on, your final slide that we've moved away from, someone asked who made the apple. So I think it's time to toot your horn.
It's so funny, and that's a really terrible picture of it, but I wanted to find an apple kind of as a symbol of teachers. And in sure, there it is, a workshop that I was doing with one of my teachers on drawing as an observation tool. I drew the same apple for 30 days in a row. And this is one of the apples. If should you ever want, I'd be delighted to show you all 30 of the pictures of this very apple.
Oh my goodness. Well, that sounds like a future talk in and of itself, the artist process, right?
That's right. That's right.
Well, thank you so much, Twyla, for this wonderful talk. It was fantastic. Thank you all for coming. And Twyla, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, have a great day.